Okay, this is the Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Babette Gruneau.
Hi, and today we have, to speak on Ukraine, we have Peter Korotaev, independent researcher and journalist, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name.
All right. Well, welcome to the show. You had an article with Vladimir Yushchenko, who was previously on the program, appeared in Al Jazeera talking about why Ukraine was having a hard time recruiting people to make war on its behalf, right? To join up in the army and fight the Russians. And so as a sort of background to that, I mean, I've been seeing like extra videos lately of people being picked up on the streets, attempting to resist being forcibly conscripted. There's people, trying to escape the country. All sorts of different things that have gone on. Sting operations where they'll pick up like 20 people in a truck that are trying to head out of the country. So before we go into like the reasons why don't you just sort of like lay down the background of what the efforts have been to try to get people into the Ukrainian military to fight, and what the resistance has been, and what the status of that is.
Thanks a lot for having me on the show, first of all. In terms of the, so until there was basically a major bill pushed through the Ukrainian parliament in the middle of 2024, which was intended to increase increased mobilization rates. Lots of but the age hasn't been changed, so it's still people older than 25 that are required to enter their military details to be mobilized. It was able to increase the amount of people mobilized, but not really sufficiently, based on what the Ukrainian government has been saying quite a while now. And lots of that increase was just because they basically reduced the medical requirements. So they put through different changes to the mobilization process, allowing people with tuberculosis and HIV to be mobilized in the army, which is which has taken place.
That's kind of shocking.
And because of these lowering of the medical requirements, that was seems to have been one of the sort of reserves that they were able to tap into for a while, were able to mobilize some more people. But obviously people have not been enthusiastic to enter their details. And what's essentially happened is that the majority of Ukrainian men that are subject to mobilization just refused to enter their details. And I mean, there are different numbers that I went through in the article, but one of them was that 6 million men did not enter their details by the deadline required, whilst 4 million people did enter their details. This is the details to the mobilization authorities, essentially, allowing them, like, once you enter your details, then you can be mobilized, essentially. So this is something that people don't want to do. And then of the 4 million people that did enter their details, according to one government official, which I cited in the article, most of them had medical reasons that allowed them to evade mobilization. Then the problem is that these medical requirements keep on changing, obviously with the idea of reducing the medical requirements for military service. And the other thing is that there's this huge issue of corruption in the throughout the whole mobilization process, but particularly in terms of getting medical slips that show you have some sort of disability. Towards the end of last year, there were a bunch of huge different scandals over the institution which hands out these slips, MSEC, where it turned out that it was just totally corrupt, had this whole conveyor belt sort of system of receiving bribes in order to get these medical slips, and often also from people who actually do have disabilities, still have to go through this whole process. Zelensky ended up sort of liquidating this whole institution which
You
also
had
sort of
officials
raises
with
questions.
you had officials with like big stacks of money and like
Yeah,
pictures of them rolling around with their girlfriends on beds just covered in bills.
well, it was a bit comical. Yeah, I mean, this was a family actually, and the mother, she was a local politician, and a member of Zelensky's party actually. I mean, like a low level, relatively low level. Well, I mean, at the regional level, quite high. And she was in charge of this military medical commission. And yeah, her house was raided, and they found $6 million US dollars in cash. And there was a photo. I think it was a photo of her son lying on this bed. Because all of her family they had medical exemptions, and basically around this whole time it emerged that all of these top officials, prosecutors, and obviously all these medical officials, all of the men in their families, even if they don't, they all have disabilities supposedly, but they're obviously quite healthy. And it's just it obviously created lots of anger among Ukrainians because it shows this social how socially unjust this whole situation is, where the sort of the elites of society essentially they don't have to fight, and but then the people who do have to fight are those that can't pay their way out of it. But Anyway, I hope but essentially the mobilization process is still continuing. It is everything's in a somewhat chaotic situation at the moment because on the one hand, in reality, mobilization is proceeding, as sort of brutally as ever. People getting, snatched up off the streets. Constant reports of, I mean, we can talk about some of the latest events that I didn't actually write about in that article that have taken place with mobilization in the past week, but just to give an overall picture, since you're asking about the overall sort of situation, the past couple of months, the government has been coming out with different announcements that not enough people are being mobilized, needs to be more mobilization. But then occasionally, I mean, the sort of communication's often quite contradictory. Sometimes they say, no, there's no problem. But right now, it's all a bit unclear, up in the air, where you have what's going on with the US. It's unclear how much assistance they'll give to Ukraine. But overall, generally, the slogan that's pushed by Ukrainian, civil society, government, and so on, is that there needs to be more mobilization. That children, well, young people younger than 25, need to be mobilized.
Hmm.
Even women should be mobilized. There's been various strange laws on that account recently. So that's essentially the situation at the
Yeah,
moment.
I mean, the last I heard, I mean, I haven't really updated myself thoroughly on this since before Trump, really, but the U.S. had been like really pressuring Ukraine to, lower the age of service and try to get
Absolutely.
in all those, 20 somethings, right?
Hmm.
And it's just the problem with that is, you use up all your young people in the war. I mean, some of them won't come back. Some of them will come back. I mean, apparently there's a lot of people walking around on prosthetics in Ukraine. Um, and it's like you lose that entire generation. And then when the war is over, you have to try to rebuild after the war. You have a huge demographic crisis because I mean you already lost a huge chunk of your population, and now you have like no young people coming up to fill those slots to be educated to like be breadwinners, and you just wind up with an enormous economic and demographic crisis after that. So it's like you're really mortgaging your future if you send those people off.
Absolutely. And I mean, one interesting dynamic that's been taking place in Ukrainian society the past, let's say about year, 6 months, is that there's sort of emerged somewhat of a split within, say, broadly speaking, Ukrainian civil society, which is obviously overwhelmingly nationalist. But on the one hand, you have these more, I suppose, traditional nationalists, particularly those affiliated with like the Azov movement, who are right wing in a very traditional sense,
Hmm.
various chauvinism and so on. And then you have these, I guess you call them liberal nationalists, who also are very nationalist, but one big difference is that they generally don't fight in the war. They're more sort of this NGO ecosystem, more USAID associated and so on. And what's interesting is that the Azov people have actually more and more been saying, look, this war is pushing us demographically into a dead end. And obviously, you can imagine that people of the sort of, right-wing persuasions are quite concerned with, demographics, right? And so they are actually criticizing these sort of liberal nationalists. Who liberal nationalists, they tend to sort of be very, very aggressively nationalistic in a way probably that's only possible for someone that is exempt from fighting, which is the case with
Yeah.
these liberal nationalists. As I wrote, there was actually a law last year in June that was passed, which exempted all employees of 133 NGOs, mainly foreign NGOs, from military service, which was quite a controversial law in Ukraine. Mainly, these were Western-funded different NGOs that generally didn't were political NGOs. They didn't really do any critical infrastructure or whatnot. They were sort of concerned with polls and political analysis and so on, collecting hit lists of undesirable people and all that. But
Great
these
thing for
sorts of
us to be
people,
funding.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
right, exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, generally USA funded, and that coterie of people is very worried at the moment. But anyway, but these types of people are very nationalistic, war, and so on. But they've actually been criticized by lots more and more by these Azov people who also have many of them have seen their friends get killed in the war and so on. Obviously, the Azov people are also very unpleasant individuals, but it is interesting observing the fact that it's quite obvious the demographic disaster that's unfolding where that so. Yeah.
It's
I
interesting if people are saying, "Oh yes, you have to have war, go at it," and all that, but they aren't willing to fight, and they
Absolutely. I
want,
mean, this is
they want to get out of it.
yeah. I mean,
absolutely. I mean, I can say in my personal experience, that's a very, very common story in Ukraine of people who are outwardly very, very patriotic and very nationalistic, but in reality, for their family, male family members, and so on, have are able to get them out of the country illegally through their connections and so on, or just generally they just they're not at any risk of being mobilized through having the right connections and so on, and being
the
part of
the
this.
classic chicken hawk profile, right? Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, I'm glad you mentioned the different types of nationalism because I think that's when I read the article, one thing I thought would maybe missing a little bit is some discussion of the nature of Ukrainian nationalism, because it's kind of there have been sort of several rounds of trying to construct a nationalism for Ukraine. I mean, it's obviously had nationalism going all the way back for a long, long time, but there's also been this effort to you know uh, gin up a certain type of national identity after the breakup of the Soviet Union. There were a lot of polls. There were people who do not feel particularly nationalistic in Ukraine that kind of don't really care whether they're identified with the Ukrainian state or the Russian state. And I think it's something that bears a little bit of analysis because I mean in the United States there's there was a lot of kind of very I don't know how to say this. It's some people look at the word nationalist and say and treat that as the identity of being just ultra nationalist. Like, oh my God, this person said they're a nationalist, and it's like, well, what's wrong with nationalism? I mean, you're a patriot, right? You believe in this country. You identify with the United States. There's nothing wrong with being a nationalist per se. There's just different types of nationalism. And I think that's something that gets overlooked. And I'd like to at least briefly touch on, what nationalism means in Ukraine and what the different types of nationalism are. Because I mean, one of the things we've seen is this sort of efforts to kind of build up a national identity around this this kind of mythological history where the French are Ukrainians because they come from Galicia, and the Sumerian culture was based around people from Sumi, and it was just some of this crazy stuff, and it's probably a very minor part of the overall picture there, but it's this stuff comes out with these kind of crazy Ukrainian scholars and so forth, and it seems to me there definitely has been a project. I'm sorry about the echo. There's been some sort of there's been various efforts to try to uh, figure out what Ukrainian national identity really means and how to be a nationalist in Ukraine. And the government, has sometimes funded efforts, and foreign governments have sometimes funded efforts to try to push that in a particular direction or another. So, what are we looking at actually on the ground?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely kind of complicated whole story. I mean
Well, I want to get your
with
article, so don't take
Ukraine.
the whole hour.
Um, yeah, I mean, one thing that I suppose should be kept in mind with Ukraine and Russia and many of these post-Soviet countries is that I mean these countries had a very vague or somewhat uh, there was not much of an emphasis on national identity until quite recently. And you had, there was in the Soviet period, there are a great many people for whom national identity was really not actually that important at all. And I mean, in fact, many people now who call themselves, these patriotic, Ukrainian ultra patriots and so on, they are actually very, somewhat in a sort of sense like denationalized people in terms of they grew up in the Soviet Union and they were born in Kazakhstan and then they moved to Moscow and then and so on and they had very little they definitely weren't sort of children of the blood and soil of Ukraine and so on and so and then in the past 30 years you've had various sort of complex well I mean various attempts to sort of construct some kind of national identity and often quite sort of very confused and very strange as you notice. I mean, this is something that's just true in Russia as well, especially in the 1990s. There was a great deal of popularity in various totally insane, all these kinds of sort of very often Nazi adjacent mythologies of Hyperborea and the Slavs coming from ancient 5 meter tall Aryan giants, all this sort of thing, which was actually very popular. And I mean, it still is very popular. It was shown on the TV and so on. And lots of people grew up as this being a sort of normal thing. I guess like the History Channel, I suppose, in the US with lots of crazy things on there. But except this was more about national history. But obviously, I mean, in Ukraine, there were, a range of different attempts to conceive of Ukraine's position in the world, in Ukraine's history, as this sort of pluralistic community of different nations, on the bridge between the East and the West, and so on. And there were plenty of people in Ukraine who did and who still do actually like believe this. But the problem that they always had was that their opponents, people who saw Ukraine as this very sort of mono-ethnic totality, this very sort of aggressive ethno-nationalist, which they were always obviously better funded from Western agencies and so on. And also, it was just a bit of an easier narrative to craft. I mean, maybe not historically accurate, but it's a very sort of
Simple and
aggressive, in
compelling. I
your
mean,
face.
yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And it's this whole, narrative of sort of suffering and martyrdom. It's very sort of in a sort of Israeli Zionist sort of similar sort of sense in which, we've suffered so much and now we should be able to do whatever we want and so on. And anyone that criticizes us, wants us to suffer again and all this sort of thing. But again, I guess what I would emphasize though is that, you know, Ukrainian nationalism is interesting because when it first emerged, there was more in the late 19th century, early 20th century. There was more of this like peasant base, of people that,
Mhm.
peasants connected with the soil and so on, and it was able to actually have at least at certain moments a certain mass appeal, particularly in World War II, and when they were able to sort of propagandize to people, and they were able to find some sort of willing ear to these different ideas. But nowadays, the problem is in Ukraine is that it's sort of an ideology that's a little bit ripped out of time, and it's not particularly interesting to many people at all. This very romantic, you know, uh, ethno-nationalist sort of narrative. And obviously, it's never really been. They've never managed to do very well at elections. And the only way they're able to sort of stay afloat is by being sort of working with their main job is working with the security services, the special services,
Hmm.
to intimidate or kill and so on the different enemies of people who say the wrong things, people who post the wrong TikToks and so on. And and so they have a place in society in that sense, but otherwise they have a very shaky position in society because they're not really particularly popular, and generally it's much more. And I mean, one of the contradictions as well is that of the say Ukrainian nationalists today is that they're actually they're serving in the interests of this liberal
Yeah.
project in Ukraine, even though they claim to hate the liberals and so on. But they're still they ultimately they know that without the support of the EU and the USA and so on,
I mean, and there's
then
also the
they
irony
would
that
have
there's
nothing.
the irony that
Yeah,
you're the ultra patriots and that you're for the the people and the land and everything, and
mm,
yet you've got all this foreign funding coming in too. That's another huge contradiction.
that's right. Yeah, I mean, actually, there was about 2 weeks ago, I think it was now, there was this whole thing with the cutting the USAID funding. And lots of these Azov types of nationalists, they were quite happy, and they were saying, "Yeah, we hate these liberals. They're all they love the LGBT and so on and so on." But then, and then lots of these Ukrainian liberals that had lost the USAID funding and that were quite unhappy about it, they sort of struck back and they pointed out, "Well, actually, you have also received plenty of USAID funding." And they posted some different of people like Yevgeny Karas, who's a very sort of vile neo-Nazi figure in Ukraine, but who criticized USA, well, like the liberals quite a lot. But he also got grants from USA, and even from Soros's Renaissance Foundation, from George Soros. And so it's very much like that. I mean, there's also a whole like in the Ukrainian right wing movement, there's somewhat of a split. I mean, there's quite a few different strands, but like the biggest sort of split is between these Azov people who are traditionally right wing and they support Trump and so on. And then you also have these sort of liberal right wingers who split off from the Azov movement, and they're actually allied with the liberal NGOs, with U.S. figures like Uliana Suprun, who's a very interesting. She was Ukraine's health minister for about 6 years. She's a U.S. citizen actually. She's from a U.S. military industrial family as well. But she was given the health ministry right after Euromaidan, even though U.S. she was a U.S. passport holder, and she conducted all these awful, neoliberal privatization reforms and so on. But she's also a very good friend of some very, very right-wing, scary people. But the people that she patronizes, like this figure Sergei Stepnenko and so on, they are sort of opposed to the Azov right-wingers, and the Azov right-wingers call them like sellout LGBT right-wingers and so on. But I mean, they're both sides are very, very, regressive and violent. But that's also an interesting sort of division that exists. But as you can see, I mean, it's very much more competition over access to funding. I mean, Sternyenka and those guys, they get more sort of Democrat Party funding. And then the Azov guys, from what I can tell, I mean, they seem to be more plugged into, I guess, what you call like I don't know, the U.S. sort of deep state sort of thing on these different, intelligence services and so on. It's somewhat hard to say. There's lots of different private security companies in Poland as well that Azov people work with quite intensively, and they support Trump. So I mean, it's a bit of a
Well,
struggle
you
over
could
the
be
power.
taking a lot of Democrat money and still be supporting Trump. No, that's
Well,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
I think they're fine with that as well. I think I mean, absolutely,
They'll,
yeah,
I
they'll take the money where they can find it.
Yeah, I understand that a
absolutely.
lot of the media in Ukraine is funded by USAID. Frankly, it came out in some of the U.S. Papers that they were also here in the U.S. Some of our media, a good deal of our media, was taking USAID funding. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, recently there was after the cutting of the USAID funding, basically all of Ukraine's biggest well, I mean, because I mean, right now in Ukraine, you do have most of the the TV at least is owned by the government. It's part of the Marathon, it's called. And they translate, fairly ridiculous narratives that most people make fun of. People don't really watch it so much anymore. But then online media, it is dominated by like the so-called independent media. And once the USAID funding was cut, they all came out with statements saying like, please, we need your assistance because they said 60 to 90% of our funding comes from USAID. And then there was a statement by, I think her name was Oksana Romanyuk or something, Romanyuk something, and she, uh, from this media ecosystem, USAID ecosystem, and she stated that 90% of Ukraine's media depended on USAID funding since 2022, the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it's definitely, I mean, it's even before the war, it's very, very media is very, very much dominated by these very funded by different Western NGOs and governments. And then I mean the flip side of this is that even though there were quite brave journalists in Ukraine that were trying to, provide a sort of rational voice to what was going on. I'm talking about before 2022. Publications like Viesti and Strana. And these were run by Ukrainians that were trying to they were criticizing nationalism and calling for sort of more, also sort of more of a left-wing perspective economically and so on. But they were relentlessly, targeted by these different right-wing groups and these other, because there was one, for instance, there's this so-called media monitor called Detector Media, but it's funded by USAID and it's been calling for donations now that USAID funding is gone. But Detector Media, it positions itself as being a media monitor in Ukraine, but in reality, it's just an incredibly aggressive sort of attack dog against any media which goes against the sort of the necessary, aggressively sort of pro-NATO and militarist position, and and then they just pick apart any article for disinformation and so on. So it definitely created a situation, already before 2022, where it's just very, very difficult in Ukraine to have the incorrect opinion, right? Like and you'll get attacked for it, in the media, and and even just at a lower level, there were lots of cases where some young, I remember it was a young girl, was like 17 or something, and posted on TikTok that she wanted the different cities she wanted to visit. And one of them was Russia, like Moscow. This was 2021. And then some nationalists found it and they got really, really angry at her. And then they like broke into her home and forced her to apologize on camera and so on. And it's a common sort of thing, is this atmosphere of total fear for speaking your opinion. My friends who are studying at, Ukrainian universities, not all of them conformed to the sort of dominant opinion in these universities of hardcore sort of nationalism and so on. And but people would joke about stabbing people who are Russian sympathizers and so on. And I mean this happened, right? This could happen to you. So people just got used to hiding their true beliefs, or just not really having an opinion about politics, because they just didn't want to get attacked having the wrong opinion. It's difficult enough to survive in Ukraine as it is economically and so on. So people just focused more on survival rather than any,
Yeah,
attempt to,
I mean, to mention briefly that the economy there is not doing well right now, to put it very mildly. Let's talk a little bit about get back to the original topic of the recruitment difficulties they have and your analysis of why that is a problem for Ukraine right now.
Yeah, I mean, we're just talking a little bit about the economic difficulties, lots of that ordinary Ukrainians face, and I mean, this sort of segues into this question very well because I mean, I guess the basic argument of that article, which is not really an argument, in a sense, it's not even my argument. This is just something that you see in Ukrainian social media all the time, or like just with my friends have this opinion, and it's a fairly popular opinion in Ukrainian society, which is namely that the Ukrainian government, the state, has not really done anything to help its citizens. and to benefit their lives. Instead, there's been a steady process of sort of degradation and decline of the past essentially 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. And now all of a sudden the government is saying that we need to sacrifice ourselves, our lives for the state. And many people don't see that as logical at all. But I mean, I think one good example of that really is, I mean, for instance, in 2020, there was this somewhat of a, well, basically the prime minister announced that there would no longer be any pensions within 10 to 15 years for Ukrainians. And he recommended people to, save up their money and so on, because there will be no pensions. And I mean, this is often blamed on the sort of demographic crisis and so on. But also, I mean, the reason there's a demographic crisis in that, there are so many older people and fewer young people who are able to work and pay for pensions. It's also just because people aren't having children. This was happening before the war anyway. I mean, Ukraine had some of the lowest, fertility rates in the world anyway before 2022. And because of these, immense economic problems that people face.
When the Soviet Union was destroyed, right? You had the same demographic issues in Russia, but then they recovered and everything kind of built back up. And in Ukraine, it just didn't go through that stage of recovery. It just stayed low.
Have people also?
Yeah, I mean,
is the problem also that a lot of young people are leaving or have left? I assume that would be a big
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yeah, in terms of Russia, I mean, it is somewhat hard to compare, I suppose, because Russia does have, serious differences between the sort of ethnically Russian parts of Russia who have quite a low birth rate, and then you have areas like the Caucasus and so on, which have a higher birth rate. In the sort of other, different parts of Russia. But I mean, there is definitely, less emigration on a constant scale in Russia. And in Ukraine, yeah, I mean, there's one statistic, for instance, which was that in 2021, they broke a record for the most emigration in 1 year since, I think it was since 2010. And it was 660,000 people left in 1 year, which is obviously, and this is one of the highest, such cases in the world. As I recall, it was like not far beyond Pakistan. Obviously, Pakistan is a country which is far bigger than Ukraine. And also,
before the war? Was that just before?
This is before the war. No, this is before the war. This is 2021. That's right. So this was before anything about war, and this was just the COVID really hit Ukraine fairly badly, just in terms of the lockdown. People already had very, very sort of unstable job situation. I mean, it wasn't a very strict lockdown in Ukraine and didn't last very long, but regardless, like the overall sort of global economic situation, there's a great deal of unemployment and just generally, I mean, it is kind of somewhat difficult to measure the incomes in Ukraine because so much of people's incomes are often many people work and get not income that's
and in
shadow
informal
economy, informal economy. But I mean, according to at least official wages, the 85% of people, this is before the war, earned under $300 a month, and that's just officially. And I mean, like, there are a great deal of people who do earn, these sort of 200, especially in the regional areas, $200, $300 a month. It is a very serious section of society. And I mean, most people are lucky if they get around $500 a month. That's considered a relatively all right salary. But on the other hand, there are quite high prices, particularly since Ukrainian economy since the 2014 had all these free trade agreements with the EU, which meant that there are lots and lots of EU products on Ukrainian Ukrainian stores. So often for not cheap as well. Often sometimes even a little bit higher prices than in the EU as well. So yeah, people have faced very serious economic difficulties in Ukraine. And ever since 2014, with the Euromaidan, sort of the big slogan of the Euromaidan government that came into power, this Euromaidan sort of revolution of dignity, as it's called by its supporters. But their big program was privatization, liberalization of the economy. And that's what they did. So they converted lots of these large enterprises and they privatized them, and also lots of state enterprises. Railway, for instance, the state railway enterprise, they sort of did lots of neoliberal optimizations so-called removing, making lots of people unemployed. And also just more generally, I mean, lots of Ukraine really, especially Ukraine's most technologically advanced sectors, industrial sectors, they were quite integrated into trade with Russia. And I mean, often it was quite a beneficial trade as well because they were essentially Russia was buying these technologically advanced products, engines, for instance, that they required for their building planes and helicopters, and then Russia would sell in exchange, cheap natural resources to Ukraine. So it was somewhat of a colonial situation in that Ukraine was exploiting Russia, you could say, selling them these advanced machinery and getting in return cheap resources. But after the Euromaidan, they really cut down on trade with Russia. The government put all these sanctions on trade with Russia, and it resulted in a very deep sort of industrial recession. And all of these, not recession is the wrong term for it. I mean, you just had all these sectors that disappeared that used to exist, like building railway. I mean, like train wagons and engines and all these sort of big cars, and these sectors really just disappeared over the past 10 years.
So much of that disappeared even before the war, and I
No,
imagine.
yeah, this is all before the war. Absolutely,
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
So now what do they do? I mean, because it's got to be even worse, right?
Yeah, no, also plenty of these factories have also been bombed by Russia during the war because they sort of produced different military products as well. So, but yeah, no, I mean it's very very bleak in the future for Ukraine, and which is why it only seems rational for the country to sort of pursue some kind of peace in order to build its economy back up. I mean, I'm not sure how it really could at this point because I don't think many countries are interested, despite all of the hype about countries rebuilding Ukraine and so on. I really doubt it'll happen. It'd be an incredibly expensive sort of endeavor to do, let alone the
I
threat of
mean,
war, meaning that
the portions that have been taken over by Russia, some of those have been rebuilt very nicely. I mean, they've rebuilt some of the cities that they've taken over on the Russian side. But yeah, I mean, it just seems like a very like the West has its uses for Ukraine, and rebuilding is not one of the key ones, right? Um, and there's this whole thing, before the war broke out about which side are we going to go with, and it's like there were advantages to going and having more stronger relationship economically and politically with Russia, and there were some of going with the EU, and it's and even then people were saying it's like we should go with the EU because then we can just leave Ukraine and go and live in Europe, right? It's been in many ways an all around bad situation. But the question is how does that relate to the recruitment issues, right? This is the
yeah.
um,
Sorry, we were
the,
a little
the,
bit sidetracked there.
the government has forsaken the people, and so the people don't feel an obligation to the state. Is that just
Well, essentially, that's right. Yeah, and I mean, like generally in Ukraine, there's very much of this sort of attitude lots of people have, uh, which are this sort of very strong, I guess you can say, individualism in the sort of sense of trying to survive for yourself and maybe for your close, family, relatives and so on. But there's definitely, not much of a feeling of, particular gratitude to the government and so on. I mean, in general as well, I mean, like, and one more thing, for instance, with, the size of the informal economy, I mean, like, it's quite normal in Ukraine people to work at companies that don't pay taxes and so on. And so then you have this situation where people are quite alienated from the government. And then all of a sudden, the government is also now asking people to sacrifice their lives for it, and capturing them on the streets. So obviously, I mean, this is not. It's very difficult to just do this huge 180 degrees turnaround, and particularly in a situation where I mean, the government in wartime is not supporting people anymore; it's supporting them less. I mean, I wrote about this in the article as well. I write about this as well on my Substack. It's called Events in Ukraine, where I sort of go into all these different current events that are happening, and where like statements, for instance, like from the social minister, where she said that there's no need for Ukrainians to expect any help from the government because we're not the ministry of handouts, she said. Uh, they need to be more, Ukrainians need to be more independent, and they need to sort of enter free swimming without our help and so on. So, I mean, this is the attitude the government has. I mean, there was a famous statement by this before the war Minister of Social Benefits saying that they need to sterilize the unemployed. She was talking about the Singapore, how it's very, inspiring example, and it's the same needs to be done in Ukraine. So it's this attitude towards people that's very, I mean, not just condescending is this sort of weak term for it, but social Darwinist in this very strong way. So yeah, and I mean, people have been, and as a result, many people in Ukraine, many men have just really closed off from when they're just hiding at home and they just don't go outside. This is the case for many, many men. Because it's illegal to leave the country. If you try and leave the country, you can get shot. This also happens where Border Patrol will sometimes shoot and kill people trying to escape the country, and this has been publicized in the media, through, Western media even has written about it. Many people, officially, 40 people have died drowning in the river trying to escape Ukraine, although the real figure is probably quite a lot higher. You have just so many people just hiding at home. And then, I mean, also there's been quite a few incidences in the past 6 months or so, particularly, and more really of Ukrainians. Obviously, this is the Ukrainian government blames this on Russian, secret services that are paying Ukrainians to do this. But Ukrainians essentially attack the mobilization officers themselves. And in the past week, there's been quite a few incidents of this. It's become a real huge sort of situation. Before, it was a thing where, especially young people, they would burn the mobilization cars on fire, and they would set them alight. But now and even any military car, they would set it alight. But then the past week, there's been first of all, a man, he shot and killed a mobilization officer. And it actually turned out that the man who shot the mobilization officer was likely himself a soldier, who was very angry, in general at the way that soldiers, because I mean, many soldiers as well, they'll fight in a war and then they just come back and they get no assistance from the government or very, very low assistance, particularly for those who are wounded, suffering from very, very serious injuries.
I remember seeing the little videos on Twitter from Ukrainian soldiers on the front line saying, as soon as we get done with the Russians, we're going to go back to Kiev and we're going to take care of those people that sent us here, right? I mean, some of those people have been sent back. Their tours have ended. They don't stay in there forever.
Well, I mean, like many do stay in there forever. I mean, like this is also a big problem in which there's actually there's no like deadline for demobilization. So if I mean, this is actually essentially the same in the Russian army as well. But if you're in the army, that's essentially forever. And there've been various protests against this. I mean, like, basically, particularly the main opposition party in the parliament, Poroshenko's party, it was this nationalist kind of pro-Western party. They're often sort of calling for there to be a demobilization bill, but then the government says we can't do this because there's not enough people at the front, so people need to stay in there. And I mean, essentially, it really depends to a large extent on the unit whether you can.
They're stuck as long as the war ends? I mean, as long as the war goes on, they're stuck until it ends?
I mean, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of people that have been fighting in the war since the very beginning, since 2022, or even before.
I mean, you get injured. You might get injured and come back, right?
Yeah, I mean, people who get injured. I mean, also, I mean, sometimes it's even an injury. It's not exactly people you still have to sort of fight, and that's also a problem. But I mean, yeah, people who get injured, and I mean, it does depend on the unit as well. That there's quite a great deal of corruption and so on. And some units just have some systems set up which allow their soldiers to have rest and so on, which is actually not like a legal mechanism, but they put these mechanisms in place because otherwise their soldiers have no rest and they can't fight properly. But it depends to a great deal on the unit and so on. But generally there is this problem where there is no fixed deadline of demobilization. And
that certainly would deter me from joining up. If
absolutely, absolutely.
if the war isn't going well, right? Which I forget, one of the public ministers said that the we're not losing the war, that just the front is moving in the wrong direction. Um, and that's not a good thing for recruiting people, right? When the front is moving in the wrong direction. If you might have people that have like a strong sense, we need to defend the homeland. The front is moving in the wrong direction. We should go there now. But if it's a life sentence, right, or a death sentence, one of the two, and it doesn't look like the things are getting better, and that front line is going to start moving the other way anytime soon. That alone is seems like it would be like a strong enough reason not to rush out and let yourself be mobilized.
Mm, absolutely, yeah, yeah. And so yeah, and recently there's just been the situation with mobilization has become just an incredibly divisive topic in society, where you have people attacking, and apart from this killing of a mobilization officer, there were also two explosions at mobilization centers in various regions of Ukraine, and the government blamed this on basically Ukrainians that they claimed had been paid by Russia or was simply. They haven't actually, as far as I noticed, they haven't come out with a story for why this man who killed the mobilization officer did so, because it seems like he was actually a veteran himself, and it's quite a complicated topic. But then in response, you had all of these people, these nationalist sort of, I guess, thought leaders, civil society, who came out very aggressively calling to give the mobilization officers the right to shoot and kill any civilians. There was and like for instance, one of these people is the one person who called is this Berlinska, and she's actually USAID and by all the different Renaissance Foundation and so on, and she was a big feminist LGBT campaigner in Ukraine for the war. Then when the war began, she went towards becoming a very, she was always a very strong, nationalist and so on. But in the wartime, she became very outspoken nationalist. And but she responded saying that anyone who criticizes mobilization online should be captured by Interpol and deported back to Ukraine. Anyone criticizing it outside of Ukraine, I assume she meant Ukrainian citizens doing so, and also that the
I
mobilization
assume she doesn't mean me.
probably not. We can only hope so. But yeah, and so there's and then the other army. There's one army woman in the army who did this long post, sort of raging at civilians, saying like civilians hate us, but they know nothing, and that they're scum, and we should be able to kill them if necessary. So there are, sections of the army that have this huge sort of hatred towards civilians. Obviously, it's not true of
Sounds
all
like
people in the army. But plenty of,
it sounds
yeah,
like they're hating their own people, though.
yeah. I guess these are more people, I suppose you can say, like professional nationalists in a sort of sense that have sort of their whole life is sort of tied with this project of some very hysterical nationalism, and they've never been very popular. They've always kind of hated the majority of Ukrainians,
I mean,
essentially, for
how
being
per, how
insufficiently patriotic.
how pervasive is all this? Is this just a very slim segment of the overall society? Because it doesn't sound like you could sustain a country if everyone had these attitudes. It sounds like you'd be already in a civil war. This can't be as pervasive as all that, or the country wouldn't be here still.
No, yeah, and these people are definitely not a majority of the population. Really, most polls and so on, it's always a bit difficult to judge from polls, but also just from personal experience. Something like 20 at tops, maybe 30% of the population, and that really have this very intense, not just emotional attachment, but also, perhaps they work in the NGO sector, or they are part of these militarized groups, or they're sort of through family kind of related to them and so on. And you do also have this phenomenon, you know where some people who can't be mobilized maybe they're women or they're older and so on, and they sort of join in this very aggressive nationalism because they can't be mobilized anyway. So it's a good way to fit in. But it's definitely not the majority population because I mean as I was saying, like what kind of characterizes these people is that they have a very deep hatred really of most of society, and this is true before the war as well, where they sort of see most of society as being these cattle, they call them bydl, which is like this popular word in Russian, in Ukrainian, which refers to it means cattle, but they use it like Russian liberals and sort of ultra nationalists and Ukrainian liberals and ultra nationalists, who are often the same people actually, but they have this conception of the masses of society as being like stupid and brainwashed and just indifferent to the sort of these high values that they hold of like national rebirth and struggle against, and they view the masses as being sort of susceptible to kind of communism and sort of and so on, and not sufficiently enthusiastic for their project of endless war and so on. And they also hated them for voting for the wrong people. So in Ukraine, it was people in elections, they wouldn't vote for these hardcore nationalists and liberals. They would vote for people like, well, like, Yanukovych, for example, the old president of Ukraine, or just other politicians that were sort of maybe corrupt and without particular many ideals, but they sort of had this they didn't have these crazy ideas
Yeah.
essentially, but they just sort of told people like, let's live and relax and sort of drink beer or whatever, have
That
barbecues,
sounds
and
pretty
people
good
voted
to
for
me.
that.
That sounds pretty
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just
That sounds,
or just
sounds better than like what living in Ukraine right now sounds like to me.
yeah, or
Let
the
me,
fact that people voted for Zelensky. The
yeah,
majority of
yeah,
people voted for Zelensky because
yeah.
Zelensky was originally this guy that was very, this chill guy that really wanted, I'm, against the war, against
Peace
nationalism as a
candidate.
Russian
Yep,
speaker.
yep, yep.
Yeah,
TV
that's right.
star.
And people voted for him,
Yeah.
and all of these nationalists and liberals, they really hate, they were all these editorials they put out at that time when he was elected of like, oh no, the stupid people have voted for their idiot again, and and this just shows how they're totally useless, and democracy is very dangerous, and so on, so on, so on.
Got to get rid of that.
uh,
Let
yeah.
me ask. We've got like a few minutes left still. Um, where is all this going, and is there a possible way out from these conditions for Ukraine? I suppose they could, radically change their demands for the outcome of the war and go to peace table and accept something that is far less than what they've been expecting. Other than that, any solution to these crises, or is it just going to keep on getting worse?
And do you see any potential for an election or anything?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been lots of talk of elections, which is interesting. I mean, I don't know. You might have been, you think you might have been referring to as well that Politico article recently, which claimed that both Trump and Putin want there to be elect. Well, not claimed. I mean, it's a fact. They both came out with statements supporting an election in Ukraine, which Zelensky is very much opposed to. And according to polls in Ukraine, Zelensky would lose some sort of election like that.
And yet
Although,
he's
of course, I
against
mean,
one because he's against
yeah,
losing. And well, what
yeah,
happens to him if he loses, right? And that's, he
that's
loses
right.
a lot of,
But I'm
you know,
absolutely. I mean, it definitely, if he loses, he's in a lot of trouble. I mean, he's made many very powerful people in Ukraine very angry. I mean, just for one, he put his former patron in jail, Igor Kolomoisky, a very important oligarch in Ukraine, one of the most powerful people in Ukraine, and Zelensky put him in jail about a year and a half ago. And he's still in jail, and he's very, very angry at Zelensky. He's actually quite good. He's quite connected with people in Trump's orbit, Kolomoisky, and he was actually. Anyway, it's a big story, big interesting story that I've written about on my Substack actually about Kolomoisky and Trump and so on. But there are some. Look, it's hard to say where it'll go. I At the moment, Trump seems to be asserting that Ukraine has to come to an agreement with Russia. But at the same time, you have some sort of contradictory statements coming out from the U.S. as well about the sort of need to pressure Russia to come to for it to agree to sort of U.S. demands. And I'm not sure if that'll happen, but who knows? Who knows? I do think, but I mean, from what I'm following in Ukraine, I mean, there are there are figures in the Ukrainian establishment that want some kind of ceasefire to take place. As I was saying, even in Azov, people, they think a ceasefire is necessary to sort of save the army, to prevent the sort of collapse of the country and the army. So that there is such a position in the special forces. I mean, the secret services, like Kirill Budanov, he recently, the head of Ukraine's
Oh yeah.
intelligence directorate, he recently came out with a statement in favor of saying that unless the war ends, Ukraine will no longer exist by the end of this year. See, he came out with this statement. Although then he claimed he didn't say it.
Russia has basically said no ceasefire, that we need a final agreement because we don't trust you. You break the agreements, and we're not going to give you a pause and then have everything fall through. So we're just going to keep fighting while we negotiate something, right? So that's Russia's position as far as I know.
It's possible. I mean, look, I mean, Russia was also quite close to signing, to withdrawing from various territories and signing an agreement back in March 2022, and it was, ruined by Boris Johnson and so on. I
think that's Russia's position, is once bitten, twice shy. I mean, it's like
It's true, but I mean,
you tricked us with Minsk, you tricked us with Istanbul, and it's like we don't want to be tricked again. So, it's going to be hard. It's a hard sell to do.
Yeah, I mean, there are people in the Russian, political world who believe this, but there are also other people in the Russian sort of establishment that have other opinions, and they're quite powerful people as well, have such perspective. Lots of Russia's business elite has not, would like to sort of have more access to Western markets again, and they are still quite. So I mean, I think it's quite complicated in terms of predicting, but I do think it is at the moment Russia is doing better on the front lines, and it is advancing, and I think that it is likely that, given that's the real situation on the front line, it seems unlikely that it would agree to some sort of ceasefire as it is, if it's proposed right now. But it's very hard to make these sort of predictions. And the other sort of aspect of it as well is that
predictions will always come back to bite you. Just tell us exactly what's going to happen. You've got 30 seconds.
But I mean, the Ukrainian government as well is generally not excited by the idea of a ceasefire, and they think as well that by mobilizing more people, they can continue the war, mobilizing younger people. There've been various sort of, over the past month and a half, different new laws which have introduced mandatory, a different form of mandatory military service for those older than 18.
It seems like they're still grasping at straws and refuse to face the inevitable, and it's just going to make things worse for a while, and things are going to have to get resolved some other way. It's just not going to be enough to do it. I mean,
yeah. Well, in Ukraine, they have they enjoy this sort of idea that Russia will collapse sometime soon, and I remember this was a very popular idea among people that I knew back there. Even if things are bad now, Russia will collapse. There could be a meteorite or whatnot.
Yeah.
So I mean, but people do believe this. People, I mean, they have to believe it, I suppose. But unfortunately,
it really sounds like they're just dreaming.
Well, and any quick final thoughts, because we're really kind of out of time here. So,
no, I mean, if you guys had any other questions, I appreciate you guys inviting me on.
I'd love to talk to you for another hour, but this is what we have. So, in that case, I'll just thank you very, very much for being on the program. It's been a delightful discussion. I'd love to have you back.
Can you give us the name of the?
Give us your Substack again.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, my Substack is called Events in Ukraine. So Events in Ukraine Substack, and I write there 2 articles a week, plenty of material, and yeah, quite a lot about mobilization as well in particular, and all these different grant nationalist divisions, Ukraine political life, which is always exciting, and yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Peter Korotaev.
Thanks so much, Gary. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
You too.